When I came to work in the Senate in the late 50s, we were right on the edge of taking up, and after months of effort, passing the first civil rights legislation since the end of the Civil War. Lyndon Johnson did that, led that charge then, and in 1960 when he did it again. By the time the movement started, by the time the sit-ins started, the students and the freedom rides in the buses going down through Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, things were moving. The politicians like Johnson were beginning to think more and more of what might be done. The real action was being generated out in the streets by very brave African Americans and many brave whites. I had a hammer in the morning, I had a hammer in the evening, all over this land. That's what provided the power, the momentum for civil rights legislation. The great voice of people like Martin Luther King and the brilliant political machinations of LBJ and other members of the Congress who took advantage of this enormous drive on the part of people who insisted on justice. I was certainly positively inclined toward civil rights legislation. But when the March on Washington occurred, when on that hot day when tens of thousands of my fellow citizens were out marching toward the Lincoln Memorial and Martin Luther King, I was apprehensive that there would be violence. I think I almost wished that this was not happening, because it was a little out of control. The control was that what would take place on the Senate floor, the House floor. That's where the rules would be observed. The speech on the Mall was not controlled by the Senate rule book.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
The two men, Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson, were about as different as two humans could be. Except that they both understood how vital it was to produce a law that would allow blacks to vote. One of them was a fantastic orator.
And I've seen the promised land.
A mover of the spirit, an enormously inspiring man who, as far as I know, never lobbied a member of Congress. Never lobbied a member of Congress. Never went up to the Hill to go see somebody. Martin Luther King didn't do that. He was out he was out getting a hose turned on him in the streets, getting threatened, physically threatened, on the Pettus Bridge. I mean, that was King. He was the guy out suffering. In the Bible, there is a description of the suffering servant. King was the suffering servant. Every time King suffered badly, the response of the Congress was to pass laws. He was an amazing figure. All these things came because of King's suffering. And yet, with all that suffering and marching and brilliant speech making, he would never have produced the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He needed to be paired up with somebody who could not stir anybody passionately with his speech making, Lyndon Johnson. He just was a genius when it came to politicking, to working the Hill, working the members of the House and the Senate.
Today is a triumph for freedom, as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield.
5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history. Integration leader Martin Luther King receives his pen, a gift he said he would cherish.
I got home one evening, walked in the house, turned on the television, and there it was. We were being told about Memphis and the shooting of King. And I called the White House car and said, "Come get me, come back and get me." Went down to the White House, stayed all night, helping put together a group of people who would go to the National Cathedral the next day, but first would meet in the White House and talk about the situation. Civil rights leaders. And the question was, would we worsen the situation if we suddenly brought a bunch of troops in with rifles and weapons? Is that going to make it all the worse? We had a conference in Washington that I was responsible for in many ways. Truman had a conference called to secure these rights back in the late 40s. This conference was called to fulfill these rights. The speaker of the evening was to be Lyndon Johnson, to be introduced by the man that he had put on the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall. Until at the last minute, Johnson decided that he would introduce Thurgood Marshall. Marshall would make the speech. And that's what happened. Johnson talked about his pride at being able to send the name of Thurgood Marshall, the man who broke the back of school segregation, to send that name to the Senate for confirmation as a justice of the Supreme Court. And then he introduced Thurgood, and the crowd went absolutely wild. And Johnson, waving to everybody, walked down the dais and out and into his car. I went out after him just to say that was great. And I opened the door, and he looked at me with an expression, I think it was the last time he ever had such an expression. It was of such joy and such pride. It's such an accomplishment. So he shook hands, thanked me, and I went back in just in time to hear a choked up Thurgood Marshall, hardly able to talk, but finally able to say, "You know, when I got started in this business, you didn't have a president of the United States who'd say anything like that about a black man." It was a great moment.